Okay, hello everyone. Our guest today on the WhiteOwl Talk series is Dr. Ramesh. Dr. Ramesh did his master's in science and tech development in BITS Pilani in 1992, and he has a PhD for experimental psychology. He now works in the University of California, Merced. He studies sensory motor network and emerging paradigm in neuroscience, in which cognitive tasks are mapped to discrete brain regions that are said to be functionally connected by using algorithms. I want to congratulate you for your paper on auditory beat and rhythm perception, which got published recently.
Thank you.
So, firstly, can you describe what it is you do in simpler terms?
Right. So I'm a cognitive scientist. So my primary aim is to understand what the mind is, specifically the human mind. I mean, because you can talk about other forms of minds like machine intelligences or artificial intelligences of sorts. But I'm interested in understanding how is it that 100 billion neurons sitting inside your head give rise to smart cognitive activities like having thoughts, having plans, having intentions and actions. But not only is the brain housed in your head, but it's sitting on top of a body. The body has sensors to get you around in the world. And the body has motor networks, which help you move in the world. So I study the interaction between these sensory and motor systems. And there are many sensory systems that we have. We have a visual system, we have an auditory system, we have a tactile system, we have chemical senses like taste and smell. I don't study those things as much, but I study touch, audition, and vision, and how they are linked to the motor system.
Understanding brain function is certainly part of breaking frontiers in human science. So, how should high school students think about the potential of neuroscience in the, say, next decade?
That's a very good question. So neuroscience and cognitive science are very interdisciplinary fields. So many of the contributions in this field have been made by people who came in from other disciplines. So for example, a lot of computer scientists who are interested in how human thought works and how human learning works came up with artificial algorithms and ways of conceiving of how the brain works. And that led to important revolutions like in AI, like machine learning and other forms of artificial intelligences. So what I think high school students should keep a focus on is in thinking about inspiration from all of the sciences, not just think of just the human mind and the brain as just this simple isolated thing, but to think and look for inspiration in physics and in biology and in computer science in trying to understand how this biological organism creates thought and structure and intelligence.
And I was watching a video of a violinist who was playing the violin while simultaneously undergoing a brain surgery. So, is this a good example of sensory motor neuroscience being applied to the medical field?
That's a very good question. So, I know the particular study that you're talking about, and so the question is in that particular study where the patient underwent surgery while playing the violin, people are trying to figure out what is the minimum what a neural circuitry that's required for playing the violin, and are they independent of certain other things that are going on in the brain. So while the demonstration itself is a little on the flashy side, what they were trying to show is that there are ways in which the brain degrades very gracefully. So if you take your computer and there's a little bit of damage somewhere, chances are the whole thing will not boot. Whereas with the human brain, even if you lose a small part of it, the rest of the functions either catch up and take over what aspect of brain function you lost, or something even more interesting happens is that it's called plasticity. The brain kind of changes its way of working. So in sensory motor neuroscience, we're very interested in this sort of changing aspect of the human brain. In fact, it gives us a lot of insight into how people learn and how people adapt to changing conditions. So one of the major applications of my area is actually neurorehabilitation. So for example, if someone's got their arm amputated, can you actually affix a robot arm, and can the brain adapt to this robot arm to control them?
Yeah.
So there are many fascinating questions out there. But I'm very glad you asked me about music, because music is something I'm very interested in personally. And music is one of those things that lights up pretty much every part of your brain. So one of the things that we're interested in studying is what makes music so special. How is it different from language? How is it different from other things? So in the last 10 years or so, my hobby interest in music also became a fairly serious professional interest.
Can you describe a typical day for a researcher in your lab?
Good question. So, well, of course, now because of COVID-19, et cetera, everything is a little different. But on a normal day in a normal functioning world, we typically run experiments on human subjects. So what we do is a combination of something called electrophysiology, which is recording from the brain itself. Because your neurons produce electrical potential. They call action potentials. And every neuron produces action potentials. So for example, if you have the intention to move your body, your neurons in your motor cortex have to fire, send out an action potential. It goes all the way down to your arm, giving it a signal to move. So by using electrophysiology, we're able to record from these neurons. Now, the challenge when you have humans is you cannot open their brain and put electrodes in there, except in that case of that violin person undergoing surgery. On an average day, we don't open people's brains. So we have to do this non-invasively. So we have tools of recording from the scalp, and there's a lot of signal processing algorithms and things that we have to develop to make sure that that recording goes smoothly. So we do experiments using electrophysiology. But what's very interesting in my lab is instead of just recording from the brain, we also try and manipulate the brain by using magnetic fields. So this is something where, this is in relation to your previous question, like what high school students should be looking for. So when you're studying physics, and if you're studying physics of magnets, for example, you realize that every electrical field has a magnetic field surrounding it. So we use that principle to put a very large magnet on top of a person's brain, and that sends out an electrical signal through the scalp into those surface neurons. And we can actually manipulate the function of these neurons. So there's two things we can do right now in the lab. One is we can put those neurons to sleep or down-regulate them. But we can also get these neurons really fired up, like we can up-regulate them. So what we're really interested in seeing is if by up-regulating these neurons, we can actually enhance someone's cognitive performance. So can you actually zap someone's brain and make them smarter? These are the sort of questions that we ask. So my typical day involves going to the lab, designing these experiments, studying people's brains, developing algorithms for analysis of this data, and then developing computational models that people can use so they can instantiate this kind of circuitry on a different sort of system, on a computational system, for example.
And what led you to this fascinating field?
I've always been interested in science at large. So I had a long and interesting career kind of getting to this point. I worked in advertising for a while. I worked for a television ratings company. It just didn't do it for me. So I ended up thinking about what it is that I want to do. And I was very interested in physics and biology, and I couldn't really decide, how they meet and what's the best intersection for those things. And so then just as a matter of chance, I happened to run into the person who would become my doctoral advisor in Connecticut. And he said, there are lots of problems on the human brain side that we haven't solved that could use someone with a good appreciation of interdisciplinary science. And so I found this problem to be really fascinating. And I started in the field by studying how the brain controls movement. And then that led to multiple other things. And over the last 20 years, it's kind of branched off into a variety of studies, beginning with the studying music in the brain, to developing brain-machine interfaces, to developing these algorithms and electrophysiology. So it's been quite fascinating. But it was really a quest for understanding what the mind is and just sort of thinking about it at large that kind of drew me into this area.
One of the researches you have worked on is auditory rhythm perception, on which you have published a paper. So can you tell us a bit about this?
Yeah, so the ability to track a rhythm or time-varying sequence of events, we think is somewhat uniquely human. There are very few species outside of humans that are good at this. Because it's not to say that that humans are the only ones that can do it. There are some birds that can. There are a few primates that can. So the question is, what exactly about the human brain gives you a representation of time and gives you a representation of how you can chunk these events together? So if you're listening to a piece of music, involuntarily you start tapping your foot, you start like bobbing your head, you fall into the rhythm of that music.
Yeah.
So what we're interested in is what is happening in your brain that makes you predict and track and follow along with that music. And what led us to this area was sort of work from evolutionary biology that suggests that motor structures, like the parts of the brain that move your body, are actually involved in processing rhythm and beat itself, like causally involved. So what we did was we had people listen to these rhythms and they had to perform mild discrimination tasks. So like, we'd play something and one beat would be slightly off. So we'd play a song, like a famous, say, rock and roll song or a jazz song, and we'd play a click track along with it. And the click track would be mismatched by just a little bit. And we looked at the ability for people to discriminate and say if the click track was on or off the beat. But before we did that, we zapped the motor areas of their brain using this magnetic stimulation method that I talked about. So when you inhibit the motor areas, so your ability to hear the rhythm is hugely compromised. And this goes against the face of everything that neuroscience has been telling us for the last 100 years or so, that the sensory systems and motor systems are completely independent. So what we've shown is that the motor system, which is in charge of moving your body, is actually causally involved in helping you hear what's going on in the world. So in a sense, the classic Aristotelian way of thinking, these are senses, these are motor functions, these are other functions, that kind of line is extremely blurred in this equation. So what we've summarized from that study is that the brain actually actively simulates the auditory rhythm, and it's using that to predict when the next beat will be. And that's what keeps us moving to the beat. And your ability to follow that particular beat depends on having an intact motor system.
And amongst the technologies available to study the brain functions, the TMS, the EEG, and the fMRIs, which one do you find the coolest?
I have to say I'm biased because I do a lot of TMS work. I think TMS is the coolest because you can actually manipulate brain function. So when you start doing EEG, which is electroencephalography, where you're recording scalp potentials, or you're doing fMRI, you can get really fancy images of the brain. You're studying what is there. But with TMS, you can actually modify brain function. Right? Like I can make someone see things. I can make someone hear things that are not real by manipulating their function. Or like I was saying, the Holy Grail is asking the question, can you actually make a person learn faster? Can you make them smarter by using this function? So there's a lot of potential. And this technology is evolving too. There are ways in which now we're looking at using ultrasound to do things which is slightly safer than using magnets on people's brains. So I have to say it's the coolest, and this is going to keep me busy for several years to come.
Elon Musk's Neuralink recently revealed details of its next generation implantable machine brain interface. So do you think this is an encouraging trend that would lead to making this futuristic vision a reality faster?
I agree. I think this is a really fascinating development. And what's really interesting with Neuralink is that Elon Musk has actually hired people from my field who are actually doing laboratory work and getting them to now think about things like brain-machine interfaces. And what I think is most fascinating about this is we learn a lot theoretically from this very applied problem, which is, can you use your thoughts to move objects in the world, right? Which is the ultimate, it's the holy grail of all brain-machine interfaces. So, and can I do that non-invasively? So one way of doing it is this implantable chip. But what we're fascinated by is, can you actually just record from the scalp in this most non-invasive way? And from those signals actually drive external objects. So can you eventually be in a self-driving car that is totally driven by your thoughts? So evidence in primates suggests that it is possible. but it involves a lot of, like what you say, implants and things going inside the brain structures. But if we can do this non-invasively, at some point, we will have these interfaces where you could just be sitting in your house and you could just think, pop the bread in the toaster, and that would just happen. Because some other device will move this in, or when you're driving and your car is is parked outside your house, you just think, start the car, and the car starts, right? So we're not that far away from it. I'm imagining in the next 20 years or so, we will have this signal from the brain's end cleaned up well enough, and we can use enough sophisticated machine learning algorithms to eventually drive external objects. So what Elon is doing is a great start. He has, of course, his own sort of business interests in this area, but theoretically as well, and scientifically speaking, this is a really rich area, and we can learn a lot from about brain function itself from studying brain-machine interfaces.
We see applications of neurorobotics in many movies. So can you tell us about how neurorobotics can help us in our daily lives?
Yeah, so at the most fundamental level, I really believe, and this is just an ethical, a moral position, that science and technology should help the most vulnerable amongst us. So one of the best examples of the use of neurorobotics is, I think I was saying this slightly earlier, is in helping individuals with disabilities. In rehabilitation, right? So we're already doing a phenomenal job with people with amputations. Our next idea would be to develop prosthetic interfaces for people who have had stroke, who've had other degenerative disorders, people with neuromuscular disorders, Lou Gehrig's disease, sort of like ALS, what Stephen Hawking has, and trying to provide them with interfaces that they can use to get around in the world. Having wheelchairs that are designed for that can work using neurorobotics, having cars or assistive devices. All of these things are, I think, extremely promising, and it's really funding from the health angle that really helps us develop these applications as well. So, for example, anything to do with where human brain interface applications are possible, right? Like in industries, in automation, like you're saying, lifting something that you cannot lift by providing someone with an exoskeleton. And the question is always, if you've seen a forklift working in a large storage facility, it's very clunky. But if you can use the sophistication of the human motor system to drive those motors, we can do these things much more efficiently. Applications like that, self-driving cars, which are driven by thought, and also helping individuals who cannot drive right now because of disabilities by providing them with this interface to drive these vehicles. So the technological applications in just the field of robotics, if you can make robots smarter by providing them assisted human intelligence, so to speak, in this sort of hybrid fashion, you can actually create a lot of value.
And my last question to you is that many people going into colleges don't know what they enjoy doing, or don't know what, or they do know what they like to do, but they don't know what they would like to take up as a career. So what advice would you give them?
Yeah, I think it is okay for people to take a slightly longer path to get to actually where they want to be, rather than, and make a few mistakes along the way, rather than choosing, this is my profession and this is what you want to do. But if at your age, 16 through 18, if people are decided, hey, I want to be a neurosurgeon and this is exactly what I want to do, then more power to you. But if you're not, and you want to get your feet wet and you want to think about things, having a strong background in science, I would say, getting a degree in one of the, basic hard sciences is a great place to start. And there are many of these interdisciplinary programs that are propping up all over the place. So for example, let me give you an example of a field somewhat different from this. A few years ago, data science was not a thing, right? All of a sudden, everyone in Silicon Valley and in Bangalore and everywhere in the world is talking about this proliferation of data. So all of a sudden, people realized, oh, there needs to be this new field where we bring elements of computer science and statistics and create this new area. So it's the student demand and student interest in these things that develops the creation of these kind of new majors. So my advice is for people to try everything out. So it's like buying a pair of shoes. You got to try several pairs before you find one that fits you. So you've got to find a science that keeps giving. You want to be in a field that will keep you entertained for a long period of time and keep you intellectually happy, and keeping an open mind, and not thinking about just intermediate solutions, but thinking about how long some of these things can be valuable to society. Would be an important aspect of people's decisions, I think.
Okay, so that's all. Thank you so much for taking the time off to speak to me today. This has been a great chat, and I'm sure many high schoolers will benefit greatly from this and understand the field of sensory motor research a lot better. And this field is super cool, and we wish you all the best with all your research.
Thank you very much, Varun. And please look up more stuff about what I do at rameshlab.com. And if you have any questions, or if any of your viewers have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me.